nuclear warheads on top. So if there was a satellite you needed to take out, you would just destroy it with a nuke. That was much easier than trying to hit it directly. And then some Soviet stuff that was going on led the U.S. to develop an air-launched ASAT in the 77 to 88 period. This involved an F-15 fighter jet and the three-stage miniature homing vehicle. So the F-15 would fly up to about 80,000 feet. Release that thing, it would go up and target a satellite. The U.S. tested it once against a solar wind satellite, just an old one we don't need anymore.
So is that nuclear or is it conventional?
Conventional is kinetic energy. So they just targeted it and ran into it at really high speed, like the Chinese just did a few years ago. And then you had the Cold War Soviet ASAT testing. And Soviets, of course, wanted to have a weapon system as well. Their system was more sophisticated because what they did is they built something where they would have a satellite that would get in behind another satellite, come up close behind it, and then detonate an explosive charge like a shotgun blast and destroy the target satellite. And that stopped in 71, but then it resumed again. And that resumption is what led the Americans to come up with the KE-ASAT that I just showed you, the miniature homing vehicle. And then after the Cold War, they realized that the Soviets had tried to put up a space-based laser test bed. You read very little about this. It looked like this. The thing failed to orbit because one of the gyroscopes on that rocket failed, and the thing just did a big arc and ended up in the Pacific Ocean, so they had to try it again. The end of the Cold War pretty much shut that down, but there's the space laser test bed on top, right there. Of course, during the Cold War, there were some efforts to try and make space a peaceful place to ban weapons. 63 was the partial test ban treaty. You'll remember, in the early 60s, there was the atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, and this really became a big environmental concern. You had strontium-90 getting into milk, and there was generally a pretty big uproar about this, particularly with some of the stuff that was going on in the Pacific. So that's what led to that. And then an extension of that really was the Outer Space Treaty. The only space weapons it prohibits are weapons of mass destruction in outer space. And then in 1972, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. By that point, the Cold War was fairly mature. You had mutual assured destruction. So there was not much point in taking, a mature stability and pushing that any further. So both sides were fairly willing to agree to keeping missile defense out of space because it just upset the whole balance of things. So space-based components of missile defense systems were outlawed. I'll just show you this just to get a general overview of thinking about space in the U.S. during the Cold War. And what you've got up here at the top is force application, and down here you've got sanctuary. So it's a continuum, kind of like that space warfare rubric that I just showed you. After Sputnik, of course, the dark line is this aggregate military vision for space. The military was gung-ho to do just about anything. But of course, in August 1960, the U.S. put up the first reconnaissance satellites. It was crucial because the Soviet Union was a closed society, and the only way to really get information about Soviet strategic forces was to have overflight. So everything that the U.S. did was aimed at maintaining overflight of other countries so that they could spy on the Soviet Union. So the civilians, all the presidents were just intent on locking down the military and not letting them do anything, because overflight was the key thing for the U.S. during that period of time. Things changed a little bit later on, because in this area here you see the civilian and the military interest in space going up, and this was because of some of the Soviet ASAT testing that was going on, and this was also partly due to the realization in the United States that space was more complicated, and what you needed was presidential space policy which addressed all these aspects of space: civilian space, military space, commercial space. And so you started to see the beginning of U.S. space policy. Of course, also what heated it up was the early 80s, 83 with Reagan and the famous Star Wars speech. And also the realization that you needed to coordinate space a little better. And you had Air Force Space Command in, I guess it was 1982, and U.S. Space Command in 1985. Of course, then the Cold War ended. So the civilian interest in space dropped right off. Clinton is the one doing line item vetoes on any sorts of space weapons proposals in the late 1990s. And yet at the same time, and this is the key thing, you had Desert Storm. And this was sort of the coming of age party for space, military space, because all of a sudden people realized, hey, we can hit things with great precision. And space is really important to having a theater of war somewhere in the world. So various things came out of that, and I'll touch on this one here, the long-range planning. So 1,000 planes dropping 9,000 bombs would hit one target because the circular error of probability was 3,300 feet. It was just really hard to hit a target. GPS changed the game. Because now one plane can drop 16 joint direct attack munitions, hit 16 different targets, because the CDP is only about 20 feet, or at least that was the case during the Gulf War. So space is huge if you're trying to have a war on the surface of the Earth. And also, this minimization of collateral damage is important too, because if you hit the building, then you don't have to level the whole block. And so this slide, I think, just is put in just to emphasize the importance of space. I mean, I've touched on navigation now, but you know, if you're trying to target something like a bridge, I mean, you need all these other things. You need communication. You need to know about weather. You need early warning. You need intelligence after the fact. You want to see that you actually hit the target. So then, you know, the recent space debate, which kicks off around the year 2000 or so, is this issue of whether space should, you know, remain sanctuary or whether weapons should be placed in space.
Yes.
Now, you know, the Commission to Assess the United States National Security Space Management and Organization is what kicked the whole thing off. I mean, Rumsfeld had chaired the Ballistic Missile Commission in '98, and Rumsfeld also chaired this. And so when the Bush administration came in, Rumsfeld, as you'll recall, was appointed to be Secretary of Defense. This is a diagram from the Space Commission. Got a space-based laser up in the corner here. And, you know, the overall feeling was that, you know, Dr. Evil had just been appointed Secretary of Defense, and the United States was going to take the world, and, you know, I'll keep going with that. One of the key things in the Space Commission is they warned of a space Pearl Harbor. Nobody really took them seriously. The critics jumped all over the administration and the people who wrote the Space Commission for saying that, but what their point was just that the U.S. was becoming more vulnerable in space, and we'll talk about why that is later. And they also said that what the U.S. was going to need maybe was the ability to project power in, from, and through space. And that was also scary because that was kind of undefined. So you had the Space Commission, and then they did a few other things. You had the withdrawal from the ABM Treaty in 2001. And then you had, after 9/11, you had the National Security Strategy, the first one that the Bush put out, saying that what they wanted was preemption. Because the idea was they didn't want to have a terrorist attack again. If they knew somebody was coming to get them, they were going to get them first. That's what that was saying. They actually weren't the first to say that. The Russians had articulated a strategy like that earlier. But this got big play in the United States. Okay, and what couldn't have helped was Edward Goldman's book here, Astropolitique. Because if you think about this from the position of sort of classical geopolitics and strategy, this seemed to extend earlier thinking about things. Alfred Thayer Mahan had talked about the importance of sea power. Later, Alfred McKinder talked about the importance of railways to Eurasian land power. And then Alexander Siversky in World War II had recognized that they were on the cusp of the ability to do strategic bombing. And so he wrote a book talking about the importance of strategic bombers and their ability to fly over poles. So Dolman sort of took this a little step further, reviewed all that, and said, well, you know, the U.S. could just take over low Earth orbit and control everything that's going on the surface of the Earth. So this was something that added to the mix. So the overall reaction, I would say, was that, particularly this. Because what everybody thought was it was going to be the whole Reagan-Star Wars thing all over again, and nobody saw a real need for that. So the question when I came to this, it was like, well, if during the Cold War there was no advantage to be gained from deploying weapons in space, what made space weapons attractive to Americans in the absence of any clear peer competitor? The Russians seemed to be a good reason to be jousting over space, but there didn't seem to be any other reasons. So let's take a look at that a little bit. What my thesis did, it certainly came up with four kind of conclusions. One was that I think popular culture played a large role in influencing this whole debate over the last 10 years. I think the decade from 92 to 2002 represented what I would call the science fiction era in military space. I think NGOs ignored the evolving nature of space technology and strategy during the 1990s. And a big part of what I did was digging into the past and reading all the documents, particularly the scientific stuff, to see what was really going on. And then, finally, I'd say the post-Cold War embrace of space weapons represented a techno-geopolitical response to changing international circumstances embodied in the microsatellite revolution. More on that later. So mostly it's just going to be a light talk about space weapons in the popular imagination. And so we'll start off with science fiction. And what I would say is this: just as epic tales of early exploration on Earth had emphasized hardship, encounters with new people, and the superiority of Western culture, so fantasy and science fiction replicated these earlier themes. In fact, the modern period of science fiction was contemporaneous with the start of the modern world era, circa about 1870, and thus in parallel with the closing of the terrestrial world, as explorers went to the last ends of the Earth, human imagination began to open up the interstellar world. And so space in the popular imagination goes back pretty far when you start looking at the various fantastic stories that exist. Of course, you had the arrival of different magazines, science fiction magazines. Edward Smith wrote the first space opera, featuring spacefaring humans encountering inferior alien forms of life and using various forms of high technology to sort of promulgate Western culture throughout the universe. So this was the kind of thinking. Of course, later there was movies. Of course, radio broadcast. I guess War of the Worlds was something that was just discussed here recently. And of course, in mid-century, you had television. And television also had a fabulous impact. So let's just set the stage for thinking about fantasy and science fiction for a minute. It's clear that generations of space enthusiasts, and probably many of you, have been inculcated by popular culture as it's expressed in science fiction. So what are some of the mechanisms by which that might occur? And there's two of them that I want to bring to your attention. Take that a bit further now. So Althusser identified 7 of these ideological state apparatuses. I want to draw your attention to the last one, because science fiction is one particular genre of the cultural, and it's an important one. And what he suggested is that the creation of subjects is done by this act of hailing, which he called interpolation. And what hailing does is it attracts attention. And what it does is it forces subjects to generate meaning when something happens. And of course, if you've grown up within a particular situation with all of these different ideologies, all of this becomes subconscious. And Althusser's classic example was, you're crossing the street, and you hear a police officer yell, "Hey, you there!" The first thing you do is look around. You don't think about it at all. It's an automatic reaction. And so what happens is subjects, should they accept the hailing, what they've done is they've constructed in some way, and Althusser's example was religion. He thought that was a particularly powerful one. An imaginary relationship with that ideology. And thus redefining, the status as a participant. And this is used a lot in analysis of advertising and film. So are you ready? Okay. I don't have to say anything, do I? That's exactly what his point was. Okay, so what did Bruce Franklin have to say? He's got a great book called War Stars. And what he talks about is how the limits of our imaginations have actually been more dangerous than our ability to design and engineer things. What does he mean by that? Well, he saw the whole thing wrapped up into 3 main fantasies. He said that, this quest for absolute security, this quest for ultimate power, and also what he identified was a sense of sublimated eroticism tied up in the purity of what he thought of as a super weapon or a divine machine. And the divine machine actually plays a huge role in the debate about space weapons, and that's what you're about to see. So now I want to talk about beam weapons for a little bit. Mostly I just want to show you some pictures. This is from a coffee table book from the mid-'80s. During the Reagan era. And he's got a pretty good point, as we shall see. So here's some early beam weapons. Now, it's interesting that the laser wasn't invented until 1960, but it's pretty clear even in 1937 people knew what to do when the beam weapons weren't got. So according to Chris Gray, the discourses of those in military research and development have become inseparable from those of science fiction writers as early as the 1940s. And one example that I'm aware of is these three guys here, who all worked at the Naval Air Materials Center in Philadelphia during the Second World War on various pretty sophisticated weapon systems. And of course, these guys also wrote science fiction. Now, Heinlein was an interesting one, so I'll just touch on him for a second, because Heinlein came up with Space Cadet, which was part of the inspiration for the Tom Corbett television series later on. And crucially, Starship Troopers has just been a blockbuster from the military side of things. Because what it did, not only did it talk about Rico's indoctrination into the military, and fighting in the galactic wars that the Earth became involved in, but this thing became part of required reading of various DoD professional military reading lists. Most recently in 2007 it was on the Navy reading list. So there's always this connection, and it's come from science fiction. Another character who had a very big impact is Jerry Brunel, who Chris Gray calls the central figure with respect to the genre of military science fiction, which blossomed in the 1980s, not surprisingly, alongside the Strategic Defense Initiative. And this thing here in the middle is very interesting, because this is another one of these super weapons. And this came out of the mind of a science fiction writer, Brunel, back in the late 1950s. He called it Thor. And what it is, it's it's kinetic energy rods. You put them in low Earth orbit, and then you could drop one on the bunker or whatever of your choice, and it has a fantastic effect. Now, Brunel was interesting too because he worked on Air Force future studies. He did work for the military as well as being a science fiction writer. And the other thing that he did is he co-authored a book in 1970 called The Strategy of Technology. And what was interesting about that, I was looking at sort of the interrelationship between technology and strategy and staying ahead in war. And what happened is all this stuff came back again because it was included in some of the stuff he was talking about in the military realm got reincorporated into some of the science fiction that he was writing. Okay, so let me just take a look at a few things here. I want to read you some quotations from some of the literature that appeared after that. And I want to start off with Smirnov's article in Air University Review, which is a U.S. Air Force journal. And he talks about space laser weapons, and he says, space laser weapons could have disproportionately high leverage in coping with many kinds of important military and geopolitical threats to American security lurking in the 1990s and beyond. And then he goes on to say, the principal conclusion drawn from this analysis is that the unique utility of space-based laser weapons for devising and building new kinds of strategic military power needed to achieve U.S. foreign policy objectives and for facilitating movement towards a post-nuclear future is compelling. Now, as space started to become a little bit more mature within the military, a crucial study was this one. And this was done in the winter of 1993-94 at Air University. This involved 350 people, produced 18 white papers, totaling 1,600 pages, and all it was about was space warfare. Now, at that time, the commander of Air University was this guy here. And in an interview, he said that these are the people who were called in to consult on Spacecast 2020. Just a little while later, Cynthia McKinley did a master's thesis at Air University down at Maxwell Air Force Base. And she made some really crucial, I'd say, observations about the military and space weapons, and I think it relates really well to this theme of science fiction and the popular imagination. And I'll just quote a few things from her thesis, because this is neat, because she was in the Air Force, like she was working with these people, so she observed all this. And she says, furthermore, armed forces personnel at the tip of the warfare spear spend most of their time focusing on the weapons of war. For those at the leading edge of technology, it's easy to understand this focus. The weapons are high-technology toys that fascinate the imagination. And then she goes on to say these facts of space attack are often dismissed or forgotten due to the exotic appeal of space attack weapons, certainly echoing this notion of the divine machine. Later she says, these weapons capture warriors' imagination because they represent scientific discoveries' latest breakthroughs in harnessing man's destructive capabilities. Additionally, they induce warriors to prepare for their employment because they promise to destroy inanimate objects hundreds of miles from the natural human domain. This promise allows their sponsors to peddle them as the necessary and sufficient space control solution. So, when you start talking about space control solutions, this is the document that really got everybody's attention back in the 90s. And this came out the year after McKinley's thesis, and this was published by United States Space Command. And it was a request really to a call by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to think about the transformation of the Department of Defense in the aftermath of the Cold War. Take a look at this. I've never seen the first page before. According to Teresa Hitchens, another issue was the pilots who did not make it up the primary Air Force chain of command tended to be shunted towards U.S. Space Command. In other words, the Air Force was seen as like the place to be. You didn't quite make the promotion, you ended up in Space Command. And she pointed out, she thought that what happened when I interviewed her, that what was going on is a lot of the top guys tended to embrace the space lasers and so forth to a greater degree as they represented the sharp point of the operation. Pilots are more drawn to that than they are to like moving a joystick and like, you know, steering a satellite around for the purpose of communication. That kind of idea. But certainly, I mean, the takeaway message here is that, right? And, oh, the back cover of that. When I interviewed John Logston at George Washington University, I talked to him about this. John Logston really is the space policy guy. He says wherever he travels in the world, this always comes up. People always want to ask him about this thing, like what were they thinking, or what, you know, how's it going to work, or what's it all about? And he said, you know, he made a really interesting comment. He said to me that the document actually meant nothing. Everybody thought, you know, this was the beginning of the takeover of the planet. He said, all this is this is Space Command's, quote, late night dreams, unquote. But of course it had another sort of meaning, didn't it? Because we talked about science fiction, and this is the takeaway message. This is what helps scare a lot of people. That's the public perception. And of course, I'll give you an example of what people thought about this. Felicity Hill of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom said, it was an alarming but apparently laughable document written by people who consume too much Star Trek. The Trekkies who wrote it are now in power, and the alarmists, the conspiracy theorists have been proven right. Missile defenses are just the thin edge of a much larger project referred to as full spectrum dominance. Well, it didn't get any better the next year because this document came out, and this was a 130-page long analysis of the problem, expounding on the 20-page vision for 2020. And although, I'll show you some pictures from this document because it was sort of interesting. SBL in its original conception, the space-based laser, was intended for missile defense. But these guys had it for being used for all kinds of things. They had it being used for space control. So the idea is, oh, while we're up there, we'll just use it for negating satellites in low Earth orbit. And while we're at it, let's have force application from space. And here's a picture of it negating a ground station somewhere in North America. So there was no limit to the imagination of U.S. Space Command back at that time. In a special issue of the journal Futures devoted to fictions and futures, Cubitt and Zardara, the two editors, suggested that what Hollywood had really done during the 1990s was adopt a new Monroe doctrine of galactic supremacy and manifest destiny, which I would argue seems to be reflected in both of these documents. Now the commentary after that, and there was quite a bit, I'll just focus on a few pieces of it. American Defense Monitor does a TV series, and if you go to the website, they have the transcripts from some of the interviews done with some of the people involved in this. Every transcript, the associated image is the space-based laser. I want to focus on this guy at the bottom because he was an extremely important guy if you don't know his name. This character here, Bob Smith, Republican from New Hampshire. And he was instrumental in the push for space weapons. He was involved in some of the funding for that and a few other things as well. But he said, and I'm just going to read you some of the stuff he was thinking, and this relates very strongly to Bruce Franklin's idea of super weapons and divine machines. He says, the American people are ready. Look at the popularity of space and science fiction films. Apollo 13, Independence Day, Armageddon, and 8 Star Trek movies. control of space is more than an emission area. It is our moral legacy, our next manifest destiny, our chance to create security for centuries to come. And in his view, a space-based laser program that does not envision a technology demonstration for 15 years or an operational capability for 35 years is not serious. Without space and the potential to inflict violence with great precision and nearly instantaneously, he predicted that the United States would become vulnerable beyond our worst fears. Which is an interesting trope in sort of American history. Okay, and of course, the important thing about Bob Smith, he's the guy responsible for the Space Commission, so when he's saying stuff like this, it gets people's attention. I just take a diagram of that. I just want to show you. This is sort of the U.S. space infrastructure at the time, and what they really felt one of the things they had to do is modernize the whole thing. Because a lot of it was old. I mean, a lot of this stuff had been going on, you know, during the whole Cold War. And the estimated cost at that point was about $60 billion, just to fix up everything that needed to be fixed and worked on. I'll just make a point here. Like, the estimated cost of the space-based laser, had it been done, was $60 to $80 billion. I think it's quite unlikely space-based laser would have really ever been funded, given all the money they had to spend on this other stuff to make it work. This is a crucial little diagram here, because all the rhetoric and stuff that I've been reading to you helped sort of set the tone for the late 90s and into the 2000s. And I think that people were really hailed by that space-based laser listed there. I don't think the other things on that list made much sense to people. More on that in a minute. Here's the quotes that I was talking about before. The thing about this is, and I don't know why they did, they actually went and put the space-based laser in the Space Commission report. I mean, the document was about 100 pages long. I mean, there's only one picture. They didn't really talk very much about it, but the fact that the picture was in there, coupled with everything else that was going on, was alarming. And so, you know, after the commission came out, you know, you look in the media, and the image that seemed to be associated with any discussion of the Space Commission, even though it was not a big part of the actual report, was the space-based laser. The space-based laser had certainly captured everybody's imagination. Well, something else that was really interesting there, around this time, you know, there'd been a lot of, in the late 90s, the U.S. always runs military war games. But the space war games appeared to have gotten out of hand by the late 1990s. P. Warden, who was Deputy Director of Operations for U.S. Space Command at that time, has noted that prior to the year 2000, space war game participants, quote, were given massive numbers of space strike capabilities, which was unrealistic, unquote. So even in the background, things seem to be getting out of hand. What really brought things down to earth was this particular document. This is authoritative. This is like right from the top, because this is how the military is going to deal with space. And so the space war games, all of a sudden all the crazy stuff stopped. Everything was reframed in terms of like it has to have some worth. It has to be important. We can't just be like having like science fiction going crazy here. So this seemed to make everybody quit what I would say was the science fiction approach, or at least start to move away from that. Another crucial document around this time was High Energy Laser Weapon Systems from the Defense Science Board Task Force. And what they did is they looked at all the different laser programs. Specifically, there's a section on space-based laser. They identified 13 high-risk technology areas. And these guys wanted to fly this thing into space, and 12 of them were going to be demonstrated on the first flight. So even from a science and technology point of view, this thing was going nowhere. And interestingly, too, some of the money being used to fund this was coming out of science and technology budgets. It wasn't actually being funded as an actual project to go. So clearly there was a small cadre of people who were really fixated on this thing and were doing everything they could to make it happen. And of course, you know, the net result of publications like this is that, oh, I should say a little bit more. What they were trying to do, it was going to be called the Space-Based Laser Integrated Flight Experiment. It had been around forever. It first got funded in '77, which not coincidentally is the year Star Wars came out. And then didn't get much funding after the Reagan Star Wars speech. And Congress, there was a lot of battles between the Republicans and the Democrats. And the Republicans, led by Bob Smith, pushed forward some funding for this thing. It wasn't that much, but again, it added to the pandemonium. The total cost would have been really high. Given all the problems that it had, I mean, it wasn't surprising at all that it was canceled. It was really a science fiction project right from the get-go, but it really did fascinate the imaginations of the people involved, I think. Okay, there was another view there, like the NGO view. And if I could sum that up in one word, it was just that people thought, like, oh my God. And this is a relevant quote. There's some pipe from the 1980s. Rebecca Johnson was one of with the Acronym Institute was one of the people who really pushed against this when it first became apparent that the Space Commission might be actually moving forward with this. And given the history of the space-based laser and the science and technology behind it, I really wonder if it really was all that well-founded or whether this had a lot more to do with the popular imagination of space. A lot of things came out after that. I'll just show you a few of them, but I'm focusing particularly on some of the imagery. Center for Defense Information had this video, Arming Heavens, the push for weapons in space. And on the cover here, I don't know if you recognize it, but this is Brunel's Thor all over again. It's kinetic energy rods that could be dropped from low Earth orbit. Great animation in the video showing this in operation. And Strategic Air Command had not asked for this since 1992. Basically about 16 years had gone by, and it basically had been dropped. There was a summer study in 2003 that said, well, maybe we should spend $20 million to see if this works out. But Air Force Transformation Flight Plan, which was a big look at all the research projects that were going on at the time, did mention it. But at the end of the document, if you go and look in the appendix, turns out it wasn't funded. So, and then the next iteration of Transformation Flight Plan in 2004 was dropped. Our own Mel Hurtig, 2 years after space-based laser was canceled, has force application from space. And Richard Darwin, of all people, in a cover story on IEEE Spectrum, has a space-based laser taken out an ICBM. Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. This is now 5 years after space-based laser's gone. We've got the space-based laser in operation again. It sort of becomes this iconic symbol of super weapons and absolute power, just as Franklin was discussing. 2008, got Scientific American, we got Space Wars, how weapons in orbit could put the Earth at risk. Okay, finally space-based laser's not there. We've got another super weapon. We've got the kinetic energy rods again, featured on this Space Wars Coming to a Sky Near You diagram. Teresa Hitchens, Director of Space Security at the Center for Defense Information, told a Council on Foreign Relations meeting in 2005 that no nation will accept the U.S. developing something they see as a Death Star. I don't think the United States would find it very comforting if China were to develop a Death Star, a 24/7 on-orbit weapon that could strike targets on the ground anywhere in 90 minutes. But there was no Death Star. Pete Warden, earlier had said, there's this sort of vision or nightmare that people have of all these weapons programs. But if you really look at the programs actually going on, we're not developing what somebody would call a space weapon. The last program we had was the space laser effort, which was canceled in 2002. So what was going on? Warden's quote was actually an essential piece of information, because in suggesting that there were no weapons in space, he hinted at the fact that there had been a strategic paradigm shift in thinking about space warfare. And that was the cue of the future. Here's some of them on the Vomit Comet. And what I got up there in the top right-hand corner is that tiny little diagram from the Space Commission. Because everybody focused on the first thing on the list. And of course, to most people unfamiliar with all this, the second and third things on the list would have meant nothing. Most of you know that the second and third things on the list are actually very important. I mean, look at POMSAT in 2003. I mean, we're talking about now microsatellites on the order of Coke can size. So, I mean, there's some conclusions I would throw at it. I think the image of the beam weapon rivets the popular imagination. I think it was certainly demonstrated through the late 90s and into 2000s. In 1990s, I think military space was inextricably connected to science fiction, partly because of all the future studies and future planning that was going on, but it produced unrealistic war games and what I would say what I would call a quixotic desire for space lasers. In the 2000s, I think the space lasers, the super weapon, were ruled out on strategic technical grounds. The war games became more realistic. The NGOs were alarmed by the science fiction and the space war images because that informs their view of what might be going on in space. And of course, Darth Vader didn't help. The NGOs too were interpolated by and adopted the fearsome image of the space superweapon, rather, in order to oppose the placement of weapons in space. NGOs largely ignored the realities associated with war in space as embodied in microsatellites. I got a bit of time in. Like 5 more minutes? Okay. Let me just do like a real concise wrap-up of all this thing. So, okay, let me just contrast a few time periods here. So Cold War reality, and I alluded to this at the beginning of the talk. Large platforms are vulnerable to destruction. You guys can build a big satellite, but I'll use a ground-based laser to shoot it down, or I'll do what the Chinese did. I'll use a kinetic energy impact, like using a ballistic missile on the surface of the Earth to take it out. That's why the Cold War was basically sanctuary. That and the need for overflight for reconnaissance of the Soviet Union. So what happened during the Cold War is space was militarized, it was not weaponized. Militarized, well sure, you got communications, geolocation, all of those things that aid the military. The takeaway message there is that big platforms are sitting ducks. Shootouts in space don't work for a reason. Okay, the post-Cold War military view. Okay, in my thesis, another whole part of this thesis is looking at the military documents, and I call it the celestial panopticon. You got a sense of that from the long-range plan images, because it's this idea of just encompassing the whole planet. And you got like space to Earth strike, and you got missile defense, and it's all locked down. Okay, this is a high ground conception. You would take the space warfare continuum all the way, that's what you get, and certainly that's weaponization. And the iconic image is that. Right? And then you've got this, the post-Cold War NGO view. If you want to understand the whole debate about the weaponization of space, which you've been hearing about for the last 10 or 15 years, this is the key thing. In my thesis, I call this the George Bush space opera. Because what the thinking is, gee, if we put weapons in space, and a lot of arguments from the Cold War are used, all the arguments that were used against space weapons in the Cold War, but the point is, like, if we do that, we're going to have global thermonuclear war. I mean, this is how they tried to frame the problem. And for a reason, because they felt that the shift from sanctuary to that first step up the space warfare ladder would lead to survivability. And I already told you, the survivability school is not really a school you want to get into, because whatever you build gets lost, and whatever they build, you shoot it down. So what's the point? So the argument is to stick with militarization. Apocalyptic, Star Wars-inspired shootouts in space. That's the takeaway frame there. I don't know why these are coming up upside down. In my computer, they come up right side up. But in space, it doesn't matter. Okay, the post-Cold War reality, microsatellite diffusion to second and third tier powers. In other words, it wasn't about the high ground at all, and it was about trying to get beyond survivability. The key thing here is actually to get between militarization and weaponization. You don't actually want to put a bunch of super weapons in orbit. And what you want is information dominance. What do the satellites do? They're just platforms for communications channels, really, and for visual imaging and all of that sort of thing. What the U.S. wants is space control. Okay, well, how did this happen? The strategic shift in thinking with regard to this was James Lee's thesis. He says, what we got to do is control the information flows. We don't want to be shooting things out of space. Blow up a satellite and creates a big mess. They did this a long time ago. You read all the criticism of the DoD, it's like, oh, they're crazy and they want to wreck space. No, that wasn't actually the case at all. You go and read through all the technical, strategic stuff, you find out that underlying the whole superweapon debate is this concern with how to overcome the limitations of the Cold War. And what evolved, like, during the 90s, even before the 90s, was this idea, a continuum of deceive, disrupt, deny, degrade, and destroy, the 5 Ds. First thing you want to do if you have to deal with an enemy satellite, you want to deceive it, so you just want to spoof it. You don't need to blow it up. Figure out what channel it's communicating on and do that. Or maybe you want to disrupt it for a while. Well, maybe you take out a ground station. You don't even have to have war in space, you can have war on the ground. Maybe you want to deny that satellite somehow. Well, I'll give you a good example of that in a minute. Destroy is like just at the very end of the bell curve. Nobody wants to go there unless like that thing is really causing a lot of problems. Same thing McKinley, I quoted from her thesis already. She laid it out pretty clearly. That the real threat was foreign remote sensing systems. Because if you have the diffusion of technology to second and third tier powers, and if you want to have regional wars, you can't have people looking at you from space and dropping short range or intermediate range ballistic missiles on you. That was the key thing. And Martin Lewicki changed the strategy game completely. Because what Martin Lewicki realized was that instead of very large platforms, you had to have many small platforms. They're hard to get, they're easy to hide, they're easy to replace. It's hard for an enemy to take them all out. And the other key point is get the most capability into orbit the fastest. Because if you can cycle your assets faster than the other guy, you're going to win the war. Case in point here with regard to the continuum. This is, I mean, the minimum argument, I would say, for the space weapons is illustrated right here. Right? TSAT's been canceled now, but what the U.S. military wanted to do is put a server in space. They wanted to be able to just upload all the information to the server and then drop it down to the people on the battlefield as they need it. Now, it's a money thing mostly with them, and plus an inability to build large, expensive systems anymore. But that's a whole other problem that they have. But if we want to interfere with laser crosslinks, you're not going to do that from the ground or by jamming them. The only way you're going to interfere with a laser crosslink is deny it somehow by putting a screen in space. If you can put a screen in space, then you stop what's going on up there. So that's your minimum sort of space weapon, like a little maneuverable piece of paper. It's not super weapons at all, which is what we often think about. So what I would argue, to kind of wrap this part of the talk up, I would say, look, if in 2003 they were building things the size of a Coke can, and if today microsatellite propulsion systems are just getting smaller and smaller, there's 19 thrusters on that chip. And I take you back to 1993, to Spacecast 2020. One of the things they were speculating on back then was microsatellites. Now, the key other piece of the puzzle, which the military started funding, sort of like they did with the X, sort of like the civil space did with the X Prize. Air Force did something called the Falcon program, but what they did is they sent out some tenders and gave some money out to people to devise innovative ways of putting small payloads into orbit quickly. This is Aerolaunch's Quick Reach being drop tested out of a C-17. I mean, it's a great system. There's no launch site on the Earth that somebody can take out. You drop this thing out of a plane anywhere in the world, you put it in any orbital plane you want, and there's Lewicki's idea of cycling your assets quickly. This is the future of space. So rather than this, it's this. What was the SBL? I don't know. I've given you some ideas. Was it something to be feared? It probably was a quest for a divine machine. Back in Spacecast 2020, General Kearns had warned of a techie takeover. He said, we got to stay on the operational messenger. We can't let people go running off building, space lasers. He specifically mentioned that. Or I suggest maybe it was a deliberate red herring. Now, after all of the stuff that had gone on during the Cold War and after the whole Reagan era, all those guys were still in the military. And I think that it's quite likely that at the very high level, some of the space-based laser stuff was deliberate. They thought, well, we'll put this super weapon up here, everybody's going to lose their minds, and then we'll cancel it, and those stealthy little microsatellites, they just slip under the radar. I think that's quite plausible. Now, I don't know how we're doing for time. We've got a few videos. I might show, I have the Chinese ASAT test if nobody's seen that, if you want to see that, because there hadn't really, the great thing about that was, there hadn't the great thing about that. The thing about that was that there hadn't been a space weapons test since about 1988, right? I showed you the historically all the space weapons testing that was going on. When the Chinese did that, that really got a lot of people's attention. The military and space got a real boost out of that. But I don't know if you could...
Yeah, actually, why don't we, what I was going to suggest is I'll
questions and then, right.
Or we can do questions along the way. I have a lot of questions. We'll let everyone go first. So. Questions for Dale?
Yeah.
So now, what's with these small platforms, these kilogram to 5 kilogram satellites, what's the current standing in the US or elsewise of operationally responsive space?
Well, it's still going forward. You can see like Falcon 9 is getting ready to launch, I think, next week. Now I think that's supposed to be the first test. I forget who built that, but that's going to be the first test of that. So it's ongoing, is what's there's still a lot of R&D going on. We haven't settled on a particular system to use. They gave them the seed money to let them develop it. Now they're just going to see how that plays out. Politically, there's problems with that, I think, in the Air Force, because there are people in the military who oppose all that. There's a lot of sort of bureaucratic, sort of behind-the-times thinking going on there, too. And so the people who are innovators are having trouble pushing that. It remains to prove itself. If it proves itself, then it's going to happen. I would argue that they can't not try and prove it because everybody else is going to do it anyway, right? So he's got everybody building these things. If you don't want to build it, it goes back to Jerry Brunel. You want to stay behind the flow of technology, then you're giving that up. So that's the answer. Yeah. Anybody else have any questions about military space? Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned about the.
Well, here, pause that.
Pause?
Yeah, do you want to pause that? Or take it back to I didn't even know it was going, but we can talk about that too. Sorry.
I can ask later.
Go ahead.
Well, you talked about the Space Council for Vision for 2020,
Yeah.
which basically went nowhere, right? And if you look at around that time, I mean, you have Star Wars at the center of SDI that essentially went in order.
Yeah.
You have the National Aerospace Plane, the X-33 is being essentially canceled.
Yeah.
Recently, we've had, of course, Bush space plan that was, go to the moon.
Overly optimistic.
Overly optimistic.
Yeah.
Okay, so it looks like on the military side and on the civilian side, you have, there seems to be some real problem with getting your act together or a sense of direction, because constantly it seems that major space programs are being avoided or shut down or whatever. Any thoughts as to what's going on here? I mean, I know that's a fairly big question.
Yeah, a lot of the really far out stuff is just really expensive, and technically, from an engineering point of view, it's not there. I mean, it's not like SBL still gets money. Like SBL, I think I got transferred back to SDIO or whatever it's called now, Police Defense and Defense Organization. I mean, they still spend probably $20 million on it to keep the dust off it and float around with the adaptive optics. So that's still going on. Space plane, of course, hypersonic vehicle, they're testing that right now, right?
Well, that's
That's actually the way of the future. They're very intent on that.
But yeah, back in the 1980s, of course, early 1990s.
Right now, they're very intent on that.
Who knows if it'll continue on?
I think it will, yeah. There's some very good reasons why that is very important. Yeah.
Actually, can you elaborate a little bit on the X-37B and what you think is that?
Oh, the space plane thing, yeah, not the hypersonic vehicle.
Okay.
Yeah, two different things. X-37B space plane is a little remote control shuttle.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting thing because Randy mentioned it. That's been going on forever.
It's been canceled by NASA once, but the Air Force.
It always goes back and forth.
Yeah.
It's nice when NASA works these things because if NASA works, it's not really military space.
Yeah.
You always have to keep that in mind, eh? Because the NASA Act, if you read it, you get to the bottom of the Act, right? It says, well, the president gets to decide whether something is actually military technology or not. So there's always that. But yeah, X-37B is definitely a going concern. I mean, they just had a successful flight. And I mean, the nice thing about that is it gives them the ability to put military payloads in orbit and not have to rely on anybody else. But certainly, U.S. launch capacity right now is not doing very well. They're going to retire the shuttle.
Question over here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess my question relates to something that's a real pain for a lot of us people who do space exploration and planetary science outside of the United States, and that's ITAR. ITAR, International Treaty on Arms Reduction. And I sort of contest that NASA is completely civilian from that point of view, because anything that, of course, goes on a launcher in the United States is considered touched by against the military, and so you have to deal with the State Department if you're a non-U.S. citizen in order to get involved with these things. My understanding is that changed back in '99, around that time when there was all this interesting stuff going on from your talk. It changed from the Commerce Department to the State Department. Do you have any ideas of why that might have been?
I don't know. I never looked into that too much. ITAR has been a pain in the ass for everybody.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
Everybody's, even in the U.S., everybody's really upset about that. Obama's just recently done a big relook at ITAR. And in fact, a whole bunch of things are now starting to get freed up. Because during the Bush administration, that just seemed to be a no-go. So ITAR is really being loosened up. Like, this is my understanding right now, although I haven't specifically been sort of following it or reading up on it. It's sort of, to me, it's been an important issue, but hasn't been one of my main concerns. And you're right, it's a huge problem.
I was just curious if there's something about the late '90s that caused this shift
Towards
sort of locking me down a lot more than it was before.
I think there was a huge, I mean, the realization that, I mean, if you go back to Spacecast and some of the earlier stuff, and you read what it says, I mean, it's clear they realized where the science and technology was going. New World Vistas was a 95 or 96 report by the Air Force Research Laboratory, and what New World Vistas did is they took everybody in the Air Force research labs, they put them all together, and they said, okay, given what's going on with the science and technology, what are reasonable directions to go in space, military space? And so you get all the scientists in the room, and you define that, and this is what helps you design what the future weapons platforms will be. And to answer your question, in a way, I would say, yeah, they could see the microsatellite thing, you can look back and they could see that coming in the diffusion of the technology. That may be part of the answer. That they wanted to lock it down because they could see that you know, staying ahead of everybody else is always a balance between the technology and the politics. You know, this is the technology of political thing I referred to once in the thesis. And so cranking down on that, that's part of your options, one of the levers you pull when you're trying to stay ahead.
So I'm going to use my prerogative. I have one question for you. I have 50 questions for you. I wanted to. So what should convince me that the U.S. has not already put a whole spectrum of active space weapons in space? How would we ever know?
They wouldn't. Because the U.S. has the best space surveillance network in the world.
So
you know, they're actively expanding that. They've just extended it into Australia. There's a space fence that you would know more about that stuff than I would. You know, but they're upgrading the space fence because right now SSN can go down to about 10 centimeters, and 10 centimeters isn't enough for pickle satellites. Right? I mean, you get things that are like right now. The huge U.S. advantages, and this is the other side of that whole military equation, is you need to be able to characterize space. You need to be able to identify everything there, and you need to know what's going on. And if all your stuff is actually slipping under the radar, that's a good thing. They have the best space surveillance network, but it's not good enough. So they're trying to upgrade that to stay ahead of everybody else.
if the Hawks really did win the ascendancy quietly, and they just said, you know, every time you put up one of these payloads, it's going to be for image intelligence. Just add these 6 other things and just, you know...
Robo-bug microsatellites. I mean, and the other thing that's just changing the game right now, you're just starting to read articles on this, is stealth technology is now at the point now, like, you know, within another 10 years, 15 years, you're going to be able to make these things stealthy and different. You're going to choose your wavelengths. Right? And when you start talking about distributed systems that people can't shoot down, well, you can make different parts of the distributed system stealthy in different wavelengths. Why not do that? But as you say, like spaceplane just landed, who knows what they were doing? Like DARPA's right into distributed apertures. And I'm sure they're flying some distributed aperture arrays. I mean, this is great for remote sensing, right? That's a big problem is your huge reconnaissance satellite. That's a big, expensive target. If you distribute that on 6 platforms, and you use the lasers to coordinate things so you can keep your optical wavefront clean, there's no reason that that's not a better way to go. If somebody takes out one element of an array, you still got 5 left, where you can replace one if you lose it.
Well, I know people have to go off to class. Let's thank Dale for that interesting help.